I've been running over to Jubilee Center to pray with all of our seniors. We're so proud of them. Most of them I had the privilege of baptizing when they were this big. Had the privilege of presenting third grader Bibles to them. Had the privilege of confirming them when they were 12, and now seeing them graduate high school and move on to many, many big opportunities that lie ahead. The food looked wonderful over there. About this time on Sunday morning, I finally start feeling hungry. Let's pray. God, we open this all-important book of yours and trust that you will help us understand, that you will help us look for those things that are forever true about you and about us, how you initiate right relationship with us, and if we appropriately respond, we can be rightly related to you by your grace, and we can be rightly related to each other if we're willing to put ourselves out for the well-being of each other. Help us and bless our time together. Amen. All right, I'm closer to giving you final details about the trip to Israel. We've firmed up the dates. We have space reserved on the airlines right now. We're looking at Monday, February 7th. As I've told you, Monday, February 7th. We plan to be back the following Thursday, February 17th. The plans now and the space we have reserved would be to fly Continental Airlines from here to Newark nonstop, and then from Newark nonstop to Tel Aviv. We would come back the same way on Continental, Tel Aviv to Newark, Newark to Tulsa. So those are the dates. I know price is very important to you. I understand that. It is to me as well. I've kept refining the itinerary a little bit. Gail and I have been 5 times. We haven't been in almost 14 years. So I've been conferring with the big company from California locally. Lisa Whited has helped us, as you know, in the past. But the wholesaler that she prefers is called Friendship Tours, and they say the hotels have changed dramatically in the last 14 years. You know that happens. Hotels that once were the best are not always the best today. So we've been trying to refine a few of those things before we print the brochure. Lisa sent me a mock-up by email Friday, and I couldn't fool with that till I had the sermon all finished up. But once I did, then I took a look and I made 3 or 4 minor changes. Some things that we've been taken to before that Gail and I didn't feel were as helpful or as meaningful as some other things. And so we're trying to put in things that I think and believe would be the most meaningful to you. We would be in 3 different hotels in the 10-day period. First, we would spend the night in Tel Aviv after we arrived late afternoon, and then we would be up at the Sea of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee. The modern-day city there is called Tiberias. A couple of nights, and then the rest of the time we would be in Jerusalem. Going out from Jerusalem a couple of times, but basically being in Jerusalem after that. So anyway, I will have a price for you very soon. I will have a brochure for you. I've got annual conference hovering, hanging over me here. So it may be a couple of weeks, could be a couple of weeks, but very soon I will know a lot more and can answer, I hope, all of your questions by that time. Okay, open your Bibles to Judges. We were on chapter 15 is where I marked that we left off last week. Judges 15. If you're new with us, let me remind those who are regulars that we are going through the Bible, however far we get. This time we've been through twice, every verse, every chapter. Not this time. It may seem so when we start reading today because there's a lot about Samson here I don't want you to miss. But then you'll see that we do skip quite a bit of material and move on to the next book from here. So right now we're dealing with the book of Judges. And I've reminded you these last couple of weeks that we're dealing with Amphictyony is what is called. It was a Greek word before it was brought into the English language, and is usually defined as a loose confederation of tribes. Now, before our hour is over today, you will see that the Israelites, as they have one generation succeed another, lose their fear of kings. 400 years of miserable servitude to the Egyptian kings, called pharaohs. And they didn't forget that right away, but one whole generation that lived out there in the desert with Moses died, and so it doesn't take long until they're seeing that all these other little tribal groups have kings. And you'll see this in the end of the book of Judges, that they've already started talking about kings. So we'll get to that. But for roughly 200 years, from about 1200 until approximately 1000, King David would found the city of Jerusalem in what we know now as the year 1000. So for about 200 years they lived as an Amphictyony, a loose confederation of tribes, and those tribes, of course, the 12 tribes descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. Okay. Even though it's been several hundred years, they still gather themselves according to their ancestry, which son of Jacob was their great-great-grandfather, and so on. All right. Right now we're dealing with a fellow named Samson. If you're new with us again, during this 200-year period, when each tribe sort of did its own thing in the Promised Land, they hoped and prayed that God would lift up a person that they called a judge who would lead them against a common enemy. So here we are in the Promised Land. We know that they settled all the way from north of the Sea of Galilee, where the tribe of Dan, D-A-N, settled, all the way down south into the Negev desert to Beersheba. Okay. So often in the Bible it will say from Dan to Beersheba, and it means from the northernmost tribe to the southernmost. They not only settled west of the Jordan, some of them settled east over in Gilead on the east side of the Jordan River. But generally this area, and this is not very far. Those of you who get to go next February will see it's only 50 miles from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. 50 miles from here to Stroud, Oklahoma. And from the northernmost part of the lake to the southernmost part of the Dead Sea, you're looking at just a little more than 100 miles. So it's very, very small. Very small. But of course, if you're walking or riding on a burro, then it would seem much bigger to you, of course. So the judges we've already dealt with, Gideon and Jephthah and Deborah, we've dealt with before. Now we've come to a fellow named Samson. Now, as we read about Samson, you will see that none of these followers of the one true God is a perfect person. And Samson is certainly flawed. He is a flawed person. You're going to hear today, as we continue our reading, that he takes up with these Philistine prostitutes. And nothing good's going to come out of that. And it doesn't. It doesn't. It gets worse and worse because he's not behaving himself. He was born to a mother and father who had wanted a baby, had not been successful in having a baby. When finally the wife conceived and Samson was about to be born, they were told, this is a special person. Be sure that all the days of his life he carries the vow of a Nazarite. And remind you, it has nothing to do with Nazareth. Nazarite was never cut your hair, don't drink wine, alcoholic beverages, and so on. You're supposed to behave yourself. It's almost a monastic kind of purity. You'll find Samson kept his hair fairly long. Everything else he violated, and eventually he let him cut his hair as well. Chapter 15 is where we left off. After a while, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife, bringing along a kid. That means a goat here, not a child. He said, "I want to go into my wife's room," but her father would not allow him to go in. Her father said, "I was sure that you had rejected her, so I gave her to your companion." Now remember the problem here. He has chosen a wife from among the Philistines, not from his own people. And it's constant strife because the Philistines and the Israelites don't get along. The Philistines live basically right along the Mediterranean in what is known today as the Gaza Strip. And you'll see a little later in our reading this morning that he takes up with a Gazite prostitute. So a forerunner of today's Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip. How well do they get along today? Well, not much better 3,200 years ago. Not much better. So when they went through this riddle process, you remember, Samson had killed a lion with his bare hands. Sometime later he found bees buzzing around in the carcass. They had made a honeycomb there. So he posed a riddle for these Philistines. I mean, he gives them trouble. They give him trouble. And when he wouldn't give them the answer to the riddle for a long time, finally the wife begs and pleads, and he gives the riddle. Her father doesn't like Samson, so he gives her to the best man of their wedding, after she's already been living as Samson's wife. "So, I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister prettier than she?" I mean, okay, we'll do the best we can to make this right. I've given the older one away, and she's now living with another man. How about the younger sister? You get the idea women weren't treated very well. Nobody asked her what she thought, whether she wanted to go anywhere with Samson or not. Why not take her instead? Samson said to them, "This time when I do mischief to the Philistines, I will be without blame." In other words, I will not forget this. You will pay. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes, took some torches. He turned the foxes tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines. Right at harvest time, it's drying in the fields. It would be very flammable, and burned up the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. And the Philistines asked, "Who has done this?" So it's escalating. Okay, many of you remember what happens to Samson and what happens to the Philistines, but this is escalating. One of the places that we want to see in Israel for sure, and I've mentioned it before, the ruins of Bet-Shean, where finally, after Israel had a king, Saul, the Philistines were at war again and tracked Saul and his sons down, killed them, and nailed their bodies to the wall at Bet-Shean. And it's one of the more remarkable digs, I think, in Israel today. Okay, who's done this? And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he, the father-in-law, has taken Samson's wife and given her to his companion." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father. Both sides are really nice people, you say. So Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will not stop until I've taken revenge on you." So he struck them down hip and thigh with great slaughter, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Etam. Then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" These are different tribal groups, you see, even though they're all Israelites battling Philistines. And they've said, "We've come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam, and they said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? I mean, they are the ones who really control this territory. What then have you done to us?" And he replied, "As they did to me, so I've done to them." They said to him, we've come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hand of the Philistines." Samson answered them, "Swear to me that you yourselves will not attack me." They said, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Now when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him, and the Spirit of the Lord, this is the word ruach, the same that was breathed into first humans, the ruach of the I am who I am rushed on him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. Then he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached down, took it, and with it killed 1,000 men. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I've slain 1,000 men. And what he really said was jawbone of an ass, you recall. So when he'd finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and that place was called Ramath Lehi. Skip on over to the next, right at the end of the chapter. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. That was pretty decisive, and they backed away for a while. So guess what? He decides to go find him a prostitute from among these people. Chapter 16. Once Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute and went into her. The Gazites were told, Samson has come here, so they circled around and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They kept quiet all night, thinking, let us wait until the light of the morning, then we will kill him. But Samson lay only with the prostitute until midnight. Then at midnight he rose up, took hold of the doors of the city gate and the 2 posts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. Understand why Hebron is a place of real contention today. It's on the West Bank. It's officially under Palestinian control, but there are some holdout Jews who live in Hebron, and every so often one of them kills the other. It's just ongoing. We've never been able to go to Hebron because it's never been considered safe, and I'm sure it will not be in February. After this, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. He's finally met his match. One woman after another, and finally, he's met his match. You know this. The lords of the Philistines came to her and said to her, coax him, find out what makes his strength so great, and how we may overpower him, so that we may bind him in order to subdue him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me what makes your strength so great, and how you could be bound, so that one could subdue you. Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that are not dried out, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else. Then the lords of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not dried out, and she bound him with them. While men were lying in wait in an inner chamber, she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of fiber snaps when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known yet. Okay. Verse 10. Then Delilah said to Samson, you've mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you could be bound. So he said to her, if they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else. So Delilah took in new ropes and bound him with them, and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. The men lying in wait were in an inner chamber. The storyteller says as an aside, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you could be bound. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and make it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else. So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head, wove them into the web, and made them tight with the pin. He's getting closer, you see, to telling all. She said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. Then she said, how can you say, I love you, when your heart is not with me? You've mocked me 3 times now, and have not told me what makes your strength so great. How dense is he? at this point. How dense that he's told her 3 things, and 3 times the Philistines have been there, and she's still, notice the words, finally, after she had nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, he was tired to death. He didn't leave her. He just got tired. So he told her his whole secret and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I've been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me. I would become weak and be like anyone else. When Delilah realized that he had told her his whole secret, she went and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, this time come up, for he has told his whole secret to me. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. Now, folks, we're talking about a fortune in that day. I mean, 1,100 pieces of silver was huge money. She let him fall asleep on her lap. She called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. He must have been a sound sleeper. He began to weaken, and his strength left him. Then she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. When he awoke from his sleep, he thought, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that Yahweh, the I am who I am, had left him. So the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison. He's taken the place of the jackass who turns the stone. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. They should have kept a barber close by. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon, and to rejoice, for they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. And when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson, and let him entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. They made him stand between the pillars. And Samson said to the attendant who held him by the hand, remember, he's blind, his eyes have been gouged out of their sockets, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, so that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the I am who I am and said, Yahweh, Elohim, remember me and strengthen me only this once, O Elohim, so that with this one act of revenge I may pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one, his left hand on the other. Then Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. He strained with all his might, and the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So those he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. Okay? The last of the big-name judges. The last of the big-name judges. Now you get a preview of what's going to come next. Look in chapter 17, verse 6. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. Now this is a sad line, because it means they have forgotten 2 really important things. One, they will be reminded by Samuel later, kings take. They take whatever they want. 400 years, they knew that. And now they've already forgotten. Only takes 2 or 3 generations, and they've forgotten. The other thing they've forgotten, of course, is the one who led them out of Egyptian slavery was the one true God. And they don't have to have a king to tell them what's right. The 10 Commandments tell them what is right. If they would have lived by the 10 Commandments that God sent down the mountain with Moses, they wouldn't have needed a king to make them do what was right. And in truth, of course, they had only a couple of kings who made them do what was right, and then everybody was doing what was wrong all over again. But we're not there yet. Here is just one verse from the storyteller saying, there was no king in Israel in those days, and all the people did whatever was right in their own eyes. Now, if you're listening to this when you cannot read nor write, if you're hearing this around a campfire, then just a paragraph later, the storyteller tells you, first verse of chapter 18, in those days there was no king in Israel. Skip to chapter 19, first verse. In those days there was no king in Israel. What do you think the point is? They're going to start asking for a king. Chapter 21, verse 25. Rabbi Zimmerman reminded us when he was here in February, people who cannot read nor write must depend upon memory. You must be able to recognize something that you've heard before. Last verse of chapter 21, in those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. They've forgotten that kings take. They have forgotten. More importantly, there's only one true God. And He has taught you, O Israel, how you shall live. And you have forgotten. Okay, any question before we leave Judges? Again, we're not trying to do every verse of every chapter this time. We're just looking at the biggest stories, the biggest and most important. So, this story of Samson, of course, is filled with exaggeration. I mean, does one man really capture 300 foxes and tie their tails together and set them on fire? I mean, this is a storyteller who's making dramatic points all along the way here of a man who could grab the bleached out jawbone of an ass and kill 1,000 men before they could hurt him. Push down 2 great pillars of the temple and kill 3,000 people who were up above. It's a story based, in fact, I'm sure, Samson, real person, but you know, the fish gets bigger and bigger. Those who caught the fish, particularly if it got away, nobody else saw it, gets bigger and bigger. And so the story gets bigger and bigger, but the point of the story is, if you abandon what God has told you, and for Samson that was, don't cut your hair. And if you forget what kings do, they take, then you're going to make the next wrong step, another wrong step. All right, ready to move on? All right, now we're going to have a book of just 4 little chapters. And it's did somebody ask a question? Yeah, Maureen. Yeah, the question was, what about the business of revenge? For sure, Maureen, there are parts of the Scriptures that are sub-Christian. I think you just have to say that are sub-Christian. I remind you of Dr. Paul Tillich, who said, the norm of theological truth for us is the Bible. The standard for truth about God is the Bible. But he said even the norm needed a norm. And in Latin he called it the norma normans, the norm that norms the norm. So if the norm, the standard by which we judge things that are true or not true about God, that which in effect judges or sets a standard for all of that book is Jesus Christ. For us, that's Jesus Christ. And so when we read something like this that doesn't sound like the way God acts as we know Him, we have to say they were interpreting. This is the way they understood it. God might have stayed back and watched the whole thing and grieved for 3,000 Philistines as much as He'd grieved about all the horrible things Samson had done. The God that we've come to know. Okay, so again, for us, it doesn't mean that all the writers of the Bible knew about Jesus, but we know about Him. We know about Him, and we know what He taught, and how He lived, and how He died, and how He was raised. And so everything in the book, the big book, is seen for us through that viewfinder. Is this the God we know in Jesus Christ? And I think you have to, all the ways, just take the way that women are mistreated, the way they are treated as property, nothing more than property, the way slaves are treated and so on. This is certainly not in keeping with the will of God. It's not in keeping with the will of God. And so when Samson prays for revenge, and he believed, the storyteller believed God gave him strength again so that he could avenge the gouging out of his own eyes, that's the way they saw it. That's the way they interpreted it, you see. When General Patton, told the chaplain, pray for good weather, and the next day the sun came out, Patton believed that, in fact, God had sent good weather. What about the Germans, many of whom also prayed to the same God, had churches all over their country? I'm not saying God doesn't help one side over the other sometimes, but I think we always have to know that where anybody's being killed, God is grieving. They're all children of His. And so if one side is worse than the other, making more mistakes than the other, doesn't mean God quit loving them. But the Bible, I think, is saying, but sometimes God stands back, hands off, and lets two enemies go at each other. And they terribly hurt each other. I don't think God was pleased that Samson's eyes were gouged out, but I think God was not pleased that 3,000 Philistines died one day either. Okay. All right. Is that all of you understand what I'm saying here? Okay. If people had understood the heart of God perfectly, if we had it down, then why would He have needed to send Jesus? If we were getting it all right, then what was the point? The point was we weren't getting it all right. Humankind was not getting it all right. And what God had been trying to say, that sometimes the Israelites heard really well. Sometimes they heard it really well. And other times they didn't. They weren't as closely tuned in. And so when one poet says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," I think he was more clearly tuned in than the one who says, "Lord, help us bash in the heads of Edomite children." You see, but they're both in the Bible. Both lines are in the Bible. So I think we have to judge what we know about God as we've come to know Him through Jesus Christ. Okay? All right. Any other questions about Judges? I don't know any other way to say. If you notice carefully what I pray every Sunday with you is, Lord, help us find those things that are forever true about you. And I hope you understand that means I think there are things in the Bible that they weren't as closely tuned in to God as they should have been. Okay, so how do we determine when they're closely tuned in and when they aren't? Is this in keeping with the God we know in Jesus Christ? And by the way, the Jews judge us the same way. The good ones, the really good ones. When Rabbi Greenberg spoke a couple of years ago at University of Tulsa, Gail and I had heard him before. He's a rabbi from New York. And he's a powerful, wonderful speaker. And he said at the University of Tulsa that night in a special lectureship, the first, I think he said 35 years or something of his life, he said, I just had nothing to do with Christians. My whole experience as a boy growing up, that we were the Christ killers, we were something, so I just had nothing for Christians, nothing to do with them. It was during the Civil Rights Movement when a lot of rabbis got involved with Dr. King and marched in those marches with him and so on. He said, I began to see that there were Christians who were doing things that I believe pleased God very much. I decided if they had that courage and that strength and that will, it was God-given. And I had to take another look at Christianity. See. Okay, so what he's saying is there are some Christians he's known who weren't acting in accordance with the God he knew. I know some of those Christians myself who don't act in accordance with the God I know. I mean, that family out of Kansas that comes down and tries to disrupt every military funeral in this country claim to be Christians. And you know their placards as families are grieving the loss of a son or daughter in war is that America's at war because we don't get rid of all the homosexuals. I mean, that's their one trump card. Homosexuality and America's acceptance of it is what's causing us to be at war. Are these folks Christian? Not the kind I know. Not the kind I want to be. Not the kind I've worked hard to try to grow all these years. So the rabbi is saying, in effect, he believes he knows, not perfectly, but knows the heart and mind of God from all the years he studied. And he saw that there were Christians who were acting in accordance with the God he knows. And that's all I'm saying about us. When we see Jews who are acting in accordance with the heart and mind of God that we know, wonderful. These are brothers and sisters we can embrace and work right alongside. They don't have to come to Boston Avenue next Sunday morning. At the synagogue, at the temple on Friday night, they've come to know that same God, same heart, same mind that we've come to know in Jesus Christ. So what I'm saying is there are places in the Old Testament in particular where we think it's sub-Christian. It's not up to par. It's not up to the standard, the norm Dr. Tillich was talking about. It's not up to the norm. And, you know, when we read words like this, God help me kill these 3,000 people for gouging out my eyes, did that really please God or not? And we have to struggle with that. Is the God we know in Jesus Christ going to be happy that 3,000 Philistines died or not? Okay. Any other questions about that? Jason had an interesting experience this week, Doctor. Our Jason is an anesthesiologist, as Dr. Swafford is. And he doesn't tell me ever the names of patients. You know, some of you say, Jason was my anesthesiologist, and I didn't know that because he doesn't tell me, you know, the patients that he sees. And he didn't call a name this week, but he sent me a little email that he was putting to sleep a person who was going to have cataract surgery to get this person, you know, enough anesthetized that those shots around the eyes wouldn't be so bad. And he said, when he went in to do that and introduced himself, I'm Dr. Biggs, I'm going to be your anesthesiologist, the surgeon said to the patient, who goes to the same church the surgeon does, Dr. Biggs here is the son of the pastor at Boston Avenue Methodist Church. And the patient said, I've watched him a few times. He's an evolutionist. And my Jason said, you are right, he is. And he emailed me that and said, "Welcome to the Bible Belt of Oklahoma." So what I've been trying to do with you for 30 years is to say to you, don't be afraid of knowledge. I mean, the evidence that there were human-like people for millions of years, at least 6 million years we know now, there were animals walking on their hind legs and starting to act more and more like us, cousins of ours, as opposed to people who know, by golly, human beings weren't created till 6,000 years ago, and that's the way it is, and so on. Well, in dealing with the Bible, I say to you every Sunday when I read from it, this is the word of the Lord. And I believe that with all of my heart. But I've also been trying to tell you all these years, it was written by real people. Real people. It didn't come down as golden plates from heaven. It was written by real people after campfire stories for several hundred years, and real people embellish stories about a guy named Samson. I mean, consider Robin Hood. I watched a program the other night after I'd finished my evangelism calling on, was there a real Robin Hood? And this was done on the History Channel, and so it was very, very interesting. Probably there was. I mean, the conclusion was probably there was. But the stories, we don't really have any of them written down for a couple of hundred years. So for 200 years, the stories were told around campfires during the medieval period, 1100s, 1200s. And then finally they got put down. And of course the stories had become more and more wonderful by that time of what this guy had done. Okay. I'm not saying that Samson is no more than Robin Hood, but I am saying humans haven't changed all that much, and that we tend to embellish our stories. So Samson, yes. But what's really good, too, is that the storytellers also tell you about Samson's weaknesses. He was not always a good man. He was a vile and evil person at times. So they can be very, very honest about that. But if you were to sit down with either of the two rabbis here in our city, I know them well enough after all these years. I've known Charles 30 years, and I've known Mark. He's been at the synagogue about 27 years now. So I've known one of them 30 years and one 27 years. I've been in a lot of discussion groups with them. They would tell you the same things about their scriptures that I'm telling you about their scriptures. They wouldn't go so far as to say that Jesus Christ becomes the norm of Scripture. I don't mean that. But they would certainly agree that these are stories told around campfires. And, the stories finally get bigger and bigger and bigger, like how old Methuselah was. How old was Methuselah? Well, nobody lived to be 1,000 years old. But the idea was if you're a really good person, you get to live longer. Now, we know that's not always true. You can do certain things to help yourself. You can exercise and eat properly and so on, and don't smoke. But we all are limited by genetic codes, and some very good people die when they're children, teenagers, early adults. So it's certainly not true all the time. But that was the belief. If you're a really good person, you end up with a lot of money and you get to live a long time. Have a lot of children, of course. And Job and others' books are written to say that ain't necessarily so. Doesn't always happen that way. Doesn't always happen that way. Okay. That's all I have to say about Judges, unless you want to say more. Let's turn to Ruth. Okay, this story, of course, becomes very important because we're now going to start hearing the cries of the people for a king. Everybody else has a king. We need a king. So here's a story about David's ancestry. A story about his ancestry. Where did his mother, grandparents come from? And we have a time of famine, and I've reminded you that even here in Oklahoma, the amount of rain that falls from one place to just a few miles apart can be dramatic. All these years I thought the Weather Bureau here was not getting it right for where I lived. I'm not questioning their gauges, just saying from where we live, I didn't always agree with the rainfall and all. So I finally got me a rain gauge and set it up in the backyard, and now I can tell you that sometimes they get 1/10 of an inch and we got an inch. Sometimes we get none and they get 1.5 inches. I mean, 15 miles can make a lot of difference. It does in the Middle East as well. And so the Israelites, that included Naomi, her husband and 2 sons, lived on the west side of the Jordan, but it was not raining, and it was raining on the east side of the Jordan, where a group of people, a tribe called the Moabites, lived. So they crossed the river to go where there's grain. But if you send your kids to college on the East Coast when they're 18 and they stay till they're 22, chances are they're going to marry somebody over there. If you send your kids to California to college, be expecting them to marry a Californian, because that's the marrying age. So what happens is they cross over, the 2 sons are the right age, so they marry Moabite women. Turns out that's not a bad thing. But it was sometimes frowned upon in the history of the Israelites. Let's just begin, and we won't get through this story today. All 4 of these chapters are really powerful. This is some people who teach the Bible just as literature say that Ruth is one of the best stories. I mean, the way it's written, constructed, put together, start to finish, this is a wonderfully written short story. As is Jonah. Wonderfully written short story. And teachers, professors of literature will say this is a story wonderfully told. Let's take a look. In the days when the judges ruled. All right, so immediately the storyteller is looking back. Okay, this is not something that got written down the day it happened. Storyteller's looking back. Looking back after the time of kings, or during the time of kings, looking back to a time before kings, that 200-year period from 1200 to 1000, when the loose confederation of tribes, the Amphictyoni, believed their God would lift up a judge. And sometimes just one tribe went out to fight an enemy, sometimes 2 or 3 tribes, never all 12 of them together during that 200-year period. All right. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. Okay, Bethlehem, we know. We know from Genesis that when Abraham and Sarah left what is modern-day Iraq and went westward and then southward, finally settled, and they had a son, Isaac, and then Isaac and Rebekah had twins, all that story of Jacob and Esau. Finally, when Jacob starts home, he's got 2 wives, as you recall. He's also fathering children with a handmaid of each of those wives. So 4 women are bearing sons for him, and he ends up with 11. And then favored wife Rachel has a second baby, and in delivery, she dies. Delivering Benjamin, they would call him in Israel, Benjamin. And they buried her where she had died at a little nowhere place called Bethlehem. And that becomes very important to the gospel writers, 2 of them, Matthew and Luke, as being the city of David, the hometown of David, if you would, and that a new Davidic king would be born in David's hometown, Bethlehem. Okay. Now, Bethlehem is, it was 5 miles from the walled city of Jerusalem. Okay, just 5 miles. It's up in the hills here as well. Guess what? If you want to go to Bethlehem, and we will, plan to, if everything goes well, we will go to Bethlehem. But you know what you have to do now? It's in the West Bank. It's controlled by Palestinians. So the bus from Jerusalem will drive you up to the fence. And you have to get off and go through the checkpoint and get on a Palestinian bus to ride another 1.5 miles into the town square of Bethlehem. And they will bring you back to the fence, and then we go through the fence and get back on the Israel light bus and ride back to Jerusalem. So Bethlehem is a part of the West Bank today, and it's controlled by Palestinians. A certain man of Bethlehem in Judah. Well, we got that. Okay, verse 2. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his two sons Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites, one of the 12 tribes. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her two sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and you know that Oprah Winfrey was named for her. Her mom got the spelling wrong. On the birth certificate, the R and the P got changed. She was being named for that one. Okay. The name of the one was Orpah. Okay, and I lost my place. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, but no babies had been born. The woman, Naomi, was left without her two sons and her husband. I think we need to stop there because I've got to go have a picture made with the seniors. They're supposed to be through eating by now, and they were still sort of, a lot of them were there, but some of them were still sort of straggling in, weren't dressed yet. So Sherry Goodwin asked and Audra asked if I would come have my picture made with them. So please don't rush off if you haven't been to church. Today's Pentecost. You see what Jackie Reichman did to decorate here for the tongues of fire? Today's Pentecost, coming with a new, fresh blowing of the Holy Spirit. So we hope you'll stay for church.